What's going on, everybody? It's me, Nicholas. I'm back again with a special video. We're bringing in my boy, Let's Play Pokemon. Why don't you come out and introduce yourself?
Hey everybody, it's Let's Play Pokemon, or Kev if you prefer. And yeah, I do I guess I started doing Pokemon sealed only videos. Now I do deck profiles and fun things like that around my favorite childhood TCG.
Yeah, and the reason why we're here together today is because I recently saw a video by the Tolarian Community College where he brought on Leonhardt to talk about how Magic and Pokemon interact in the card game space, compare and contrast them and stuff. And I thought, hey, what if I did that for Yu-Gi-Oh and Pokemon? Because as you all might know, if my channel didn't indicate it, Yu-Gi-Oh is like my main TCG, and I brought on Let's Play Pokemon because he is my resident Pokemon enjoyer. And I've just got a couple of topics to talk about, like comparing the card game differences, similarities, and how they really are defined in the trading card game space. So the first thing I have in mind is I want to talk about entry costs and maintenance costs, because Pokemon is usually seen as the most accessible, easiest to get into card game in terms of money wise, whereas Yu-Gi-Oh, there's sometimes where you can get in for $50, and sometimes oh well, I've got to get at least 3 of each of these $100 staple cards to play the game.
Yep, yes. I hear it's worse these days.
Yeah, but first I want to talk about entry costs. So entry cost is what do I have to do to start playing this game? With deck, sleeves, required staples. How do I get into this game? What am I looking at to just try and play this game?
Right on.
For Yu-Gi-Oh, that's kind of variable. So at the very least, of course, you need a deck. Now, depending on what deck you want to play, that's going to cost a different amount of money. I think when most people start the game, they're probably going to want to go for something a little more casual. So those are usually cheaper. You can probably get a deck core for I don't know, $50-ish. And then when you're starting the game, you also want to try and start picking up some of the staples too. So usually you're going to try to end up with some Ash Blossoms and Effect Failures, those things, which will run you place at Ash Blossoms $60 now. So that's me more than your deck core.
Wow.
So it's pretty expensive to start an entry into Yu-Gi-Oh because of all the stuff you have to pick up right away. What about for Pokemon?
Pokemon's interesting. For I think the last block, things were a little bit cheaper, and at the start of the current block, things are pretty good. The Pokemon company's actually been really great about printing affordable deck cores. Maybe not as definitely not as great as a Yu-Gi-Oh structure deck. But we have these things called League Battle decks, for example, which are about 25 $30 Canadian. So I guess that's 35 or 40 on your side of the border there. And they're really good. Depending on, again, the block, last block when it was tag teams, you could basically get 80-85% of a competitive meta deck right then and there, and then you could probably flesh out the rest with $10 or $15 worth of singles. So in that sense, it's actually been pretty good. Things have changed a little bit recently, obviously, since the pandemic made physical product a little harder to get a hold of, and also in the post Logan Paul era, with all the hype for the TCG, most of the staple cards for the really popular decks nowadays, your evolutions, Jolteon VMAX, for example, Shadow Rider, Calyrex, Mew VMAX, things like those. Those are actually quite a bit more expensive. So for your evolution lines, which typically it's a 4-4 split, maybe a 4-3 split of your main attacking Pokemon, those can actually get pretty expensive. Some of them, Jolteon VMAX being a good example, that's $20 for just that one. You need to have the V that it evolves from, which is $5 on its own. So I mean, that is $100 right there if you're getting that full 4-4 set. Right now, the rest of the deck is probably pretty cheap. You can get most of the singles for anywhere from 25 cents to $1 a pop, depending on what you're looking for. Yeah, it depends. It's still pretty affordable, compared to Yu-Gi-Oh, where some of the meta decks, as far as I'm aware, can still run you a couple hundred, maybe even $1,000, depending on if you're chasing the what's his name? Destiny Hero Phoenix
Destroy
Destroyer.
Phoenix Enforcer.
Destroyer Phoenix Enforcer. Yeah, like if you're going after crazy stuff like that, or maybe Dragoon when it first came out, like, we don't
Oh,
have anything
Dragoon is like
approaching those
doubled in
prices.
price.
Yeah. Jeez. But no, like for the most part, it is a bit more expensive generally speaking. But it's certainly the cheapest out of all the card games out there right now, except for maybe Digimon, depending on like what your supplies are looking like there.
Yeah, and that's really interesting because you're talking about like, oh, $100 for 8 cards. I'm thinking, man, maybe one day I'll be able to afford the $120 Dragoon. Granted, you only need one Dragoon, but
Yeah.
still. Or like our top deck right now, Sword Soul, their main starter Moye, I think is like 30 or $40 a pop, and you need 3 of them, and that's just Moye. And like, yeah, it's kind of crazy right now. Granted, we
Mhm.
have some budget options, so I think everything that was reprinted in the tins, you can get all those deck cores for like $20. I think Tri Brigade's like the most expensive card is
Mhm.
Kit at maybe $5 now. It was just a super, so you can even pull that if you feel like it. But yeah, the real cost of Yu-Gi-Oh! I feel like is in all of our staples. So like I
Mm.
mentioned Ash earlier. You really, even if it's not good right now, you still want to play set of it because it will be good again someday. Uh, and just any other hand trap. We also, if you want to take things to like past local levels, like regional, or we got YCS is coming up in a week, which are our like big, huge tourneys. You're gonna want to get your playset of stuff like Forbidden Droplets, which is like 110, $120 a copy after getting a reprint. Obviously, it's a little more expensive to get into. Another thing I want to talk about is what I like to call maintenance costs. Like, how much do I have to keep pumping into this game to like continue to stay viable? So for Yu-Gi-Oh, I actually think it's somewhat the maintenance cost is slightly low once you've gotten past that first hurdle because there's no rotation. So like once you have a deck, once you have your staples, you never need to buy them again unless they get banned. But once you have that, like you're set. Maybe like 1 or 2 cards will come out in the future that you'll need to pick up, but not as much as needed. Like there's no rotation. You can just like, keep playing whatever you have forever.
Yeah, that's a huge differentiator there. Like the thing that's not great about Pokemon, and I will add the caveat here that we technically have an Eternal format in Expanded. Not that anyone plays that, sadly, but yeah, it's the maintenance cost is a little higher for the standard format because obviously rotation, it is a thing. I can't remember if it's like 8 or 10 sets that we keep in the standard block. Like right now, it's Sword and Shield through Fusion Strike, and rotation obviously is it's a double-edged sword because if you're looking to play the Eternal like expanded format, that's actually good because those decks are set and then the price of them actually goes down once cards have rotated out of standard. But on the flip
Unless the card's in
side,
Charizard.
yeah, except for your like Black Hollow Charizards. But the double-edged sword there is that in standard, I find especially in the current block, decks decks are only really viable for about 2, 3, maybe 4 sets before something new comes out, and you basically have to toss that out. Like a perfect example would be Scorch VMAX, which was like the big fire type deck for a while. It came out about 3 sets into the current block. It was really good for a couple months. It was a top 10 meta contender. And then after the rotation hit it and took away a supporter card that it really needed in Welder, and B, just other stuff came out, faster things in battle styles, for example, with the Urshifus, that dropped off the face of the earth. So if you'd invested heavily into that, and again, I mean, maybe you spent like 60 to $80 for like your main attacker line there, you still had to toss pretty much all of that deck. Like the whole fire archetype basically disappeared overnight, and now you might have had to shell out like $120, let's say, for like your rapid strike Urshifu to replace it, and that replaced it just a couple sets later. And you see it happening more and more and more, especially with the last set, Fusion Strike, which just completely replaced the meta with basically a tier 0 deck. And for most people, yeah, it's like you're throwing stuff out a lot more than you'd like to. And that's kind of why I think you Yu-Gi-Oh players are in a better spot there. Because you do have that eternal format, right? Like your old cards can become usable again, like way down the road. You guys have legacy support for different archetypes. We don't have that, right? Standard, it's like a very narrow window. And by design, I feel like the Pokemon Company does basically say, yeah, every like 2-3 sets, we're just going to feed you a new deck. And that's the one you got to run with.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. I think the idea of like, every like 4 sets a new deck comes in and then validates everything. That's mostly true for Yu-Gi-Oh. Less true since I want to say like 2019, because we've had a lot of these like really long formats. So in like 2019, we had what we call Toss format, the Eternal format, where that only ended because they banned literally everything. People have been normal summoning Alistair for 5 years now. Um, the Burning Abyss deck, it's known as the deck that will never die. It's been around since like 2014 and people are still forcing it to work. It still gets tops. As much as we like to complain about the cost of Yu-Gi-Oh, and rightfully so, it is nice being able to know, hey, you know what? I can always just stick with Old Faithful.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that brings us into another like thing I want to talk about is rotation. So Yu-Gi-Oh doesn't have rotation, and that is both to the detriment and to the whatever the opposite word of detriment is for the game. So like, sure, we get to play with our decks forever and ever and ever. That's awesome, outside of a ban. But it also means that the Pokemon, or not the Pokemon Company, that Konami is forced to make decks stronger and stronger and stronger on a faster rate than a game that does have that rotation. So if you want something that can like finally power creep out normal summon Alistair, it's got to be like a 20 on a 0 out of 10 scale, which is frustrating to some people because we've had some very powerful decks. Also, not having rotation means that the decks that you hate are going to be around forever too, which is why normal summon Alistair is a meme. Like no one really likes that strategy outside of the people who play it. And I just every single time a ban list rolls around, people like say, "Yes, this will be the time," and then it never is. So you're stuck playing against that strategy you hate forever. Whereas if we had a rotation, that would have been gone like 3 years ago, and we can play with the new stuff now.
Yeah, I mean, like, I certainly understand, like, where you're coming from there. Rotation is useful in that it gives the game designers a way to maybe, like, wipe away an old format or problem cards. Again, like, you kind of have, like, a soft rotation in Yu-Gi-Oh! In that stuff from much older sets, like you mentioned, it just can't keep up because it's been power crept, right? And, like, to the best, to the best of my understanding, like, I quit a little while before like synchros became a thing. Like your soft rotation is basically every time you guys get a new summoning mechanic, right? Like that, generally speaking, is when the speed of Yu-Gi-Oh seems to accelerate. Like for synchros, it looks like, oh, suddenly you needed to be able to put a ton of bodies on board, right? Like at specific levels. So you had a lot of things that would allow you to special summon a lot quicker. And obviously, like once you got to things like Xyz summoning as well, same thing. You need to put a lot more bodies on board, not just like the 2 that you'd need for like a synchro or a fusion summon. Maybe you need like 3 or 4 materials, and it just gets faster and faster. You have links, which require you to be, chaining special summons together. So like in that sense, every time that new mechanic comes out, it necessarily power creeps the old ones so that like, Konami can get you guys playing the new mechanic, right? Like I understand that in Yu-Gi-Oh, they generally speaking, like for every new summoning mechanic, they'll print like a really powerful, like generic monster that goes with it, and like it's gonna get hit on the ban list, like if not right away in a couple months, like after the next few sets have come out and people have like gone on to the mechanic. But it's basically there to force you to put away your old stuff and like go in on this new mechanic. It's like, oh, like Summon Sorceress is so good, like I have to play Lynx now, right? So like you've kind of rotated your stuff out in that sense. But I mean, on the other hand, like it's tricky because in Pokemon you can kind of like get rid of these older problematic cards, but when you're power creeping anyways, and stuff like just within one block can't keep up with the cards that are printed later on, I don't see much of a point in it. And we do technically have that eternal format in expanded, where the power differentials between the different blocks, especially in the last year or two, it kind of like you get the impression that stuff isn't balanced for that format at all, right? So in a sense, it's not like having an eternal format would fix things for Pokemon either, because you can't compete with like the old classics, no matter how hard you
Old
try. Like,
faithful.
yeah, like outside of really staple stuff in the way that like Monster Reborn is still good, right? Like, hey, there's like a good generic extender. It's still great after all these years now that it's unbanned. I guess in the same way we'll have like our ace specs and like computer search, which is like, hey, there's your discard 2 for an Omni search. Like, that'll always be good, but you're putting that alongside like 300 plus HP bodies now that can do like 150
Yikes.
damage for 1 energy, whereas like a couple years ago when that was printed, like things had 170 HP and like they were 3-shotting each other. It's like it does 90 damage for 3 energy. Whoa. Right? Um yeah, it's a tricky thing. Like, rotation, it's good for Pokemon too, in the sense that it's nice to see the new mechanics and you don't have to worry necessarily about hitting like every different major mechanic or special type of Pokemon in the way that you guys, it's like, because you have all these summoning mechanics like kind of playing together, it's like, okay, your deck, generally speaking, you have to build it to be able to deal with like people synchro spamming, like Xyz summoning like crazy. Like, you have to factor in that links are going to be a thing and there's an extra monster zone there. Like, you guys have to deal with all of that constantly. Whereas, I only have to worry about like Pokemon VMAX right now, for example, and in like a month, Pokemon V Star. I don't also have to worry about EXs, now GXs, breaks, like primes, all this kind of stuff, right? Like, yeah, it's just easier, right? There's less to account for, and it can help to keep things fresh and I guess less generic as well, right?
Hmm. I agree with that. Yeah, I think rotation works specifically in Pokemon. At this point, obviously, we could never bring a rotation to Yu-Gi-Oh just because of how fundamentally the game is as a game. Like, you need all those old staples because just certain decks just don't work without them anymore. Like, let's talk about Flunder. It's a good deck, but it wouldn't be where as good as it is if it didn't have access to like Rise of the Mega Monarch or Barrier Statue of the Stormwinds, and those are all old cards. Like Barrier Statue's probably like 15 years old, and Rise is like 6, 7 years old. So these old cards, they help prop up newer decks as well, and that helps us like be able to play with new things.
No,
Or
for
like
sure. I
maybe a
mean, like,
card.
you guys would also go crazy, like, given the investment that you guys put into a lot of decks, right? It's like,
Hmm.
because you're expecting things aren't going to rotate, that like, hey, I can still be normal summoning Alistair probably 8 years from now, or I'll find a way to make it work again. So if Konami all of a sudden decided to rotate, you'd have a lot of very pissed off players, because it's like, oh, what
Oh
do I do with
yes.
my playset of like Alistair or a Dusted Gold, right?
Oh yes. Speaking of ruining players' wallets, let's talk about ban lists. From what I understand, Pokemon does not ban very often, whereas here in Yu-Gi-Oh, we have a quarterly ban list. It's always like no sooner than X date, which actually our new ban list is due in a few weeks now. And ban lists are very contentious. It's both seen as like Christmas, like, ah, yeah, we're gonna see cool stuff come back that we can finally play these strategies again, or oh, yeah, that boogeyman's finally gonna die. But on the other hand, you see, oh, well, I spent $1,000 on Soul Soul. They ban my Moyes. Well, there goes my investment. It's just an interesting dynamic. Like, I remember the last ban list was a very like little tap on the wrist to a lot of decks, didn't ban a lot, so the format didn't change. However, it also didn't really bug with players investments. Now, going back to a ban list like I think it was the March 2020 ban list, that banned every single top deck. So it got rid of Thunder Dragon Colossus, banning that deck. It got rid of Mirage Stalio, which got rid of Salamangreat. It got rid of Harpor, which took Orcus out of the meta, and it got rid of Engage, which took Sky Striker out of the meta, completely destroying the format. Decks people have been playing for years. Many of them were quite expensive at the time. I think this was Engage was still $80, which you're only running one, but still $80. And that was a really interesting time because on the one hand, people were sad because their decks that they loved were gone, but on the other hand, that opened the format really wide, and we started getting new stuff. Like Spiral made a comeback at that time, I believe. Dinos came back, and it also opened the door for stuff like Eldritch and Adamancipator to come in, which I think Adamancipator would have been good regardless, but that's for another topic. But yeah, basically our ban lists are the closest thing we have to rotation, and they're a really interesting thing that Yu-Gi-Oh has over other card games because I just don't see other card games banning quite as much as we do.
Mm. Yeah, Pokemon, while it does technically have a ban list, it's rarely ever touched. Technically speaking, it is revisited every time a set comes out, but at least for the standard format, they haven't touched anything in a really long time. And obviously, outside of mechanics, like specifically where a card is printed to say you can only have like one copy of this card in your deck, or if you have already played one card, then you can't play another. Like we don't have any kind of limited or like semi-limited list either. On the one hand, like it's nice in the sense that you don't have to worry. I guess if you're heavily invested into a deck, you're not worrying about something getting banned. Like Mew VMAX, for example, which is like the tier 0 deck right now. You can you can feel pretty secure that, yeah, well, you dropped a couple $100 to like build out the core of that deck. It's not going anywhere, right? Like I haven't seen an emergency ban in this game in a long time. There was one a little while back, like a once in a blue moon thing, where they banned a supporter card and one Pokemon. The supporter, it was kind of a mill card, but also allowed you to take Pokemon off of the opponent's bench. The theory was that that particular supporter, Belelba and Bryson Man, was banned in order to protect the Eternatus VMAX deck, which was just coming in and required you to like have a big bench. It allowed you to bench a couple extra Pokemon than usual. And then the other one was one that contributed to control strategies, right? Like you intentionally went down on prizes and then you could basically handlock your opponent with that. But outside of those, it just doesn't really happen. Expanded is a little bit different. Expanded has an extremely robust ban list, mostly geared towards eliminating anything like control or stall strategies. Just because, like we mentioned before in our discussion about rotation, you don't get the impression that things are really being tested to see if they work in expanded as well as standard. So you have the opportunity to create a lot of things like infinite loops, for example. It's very, very easy with a lot of different cards like Reset Stamp, which just rotated out of standard. You can reset your opponent's hand to however many prize cards they have remaining. So cool, like if your opponent got a little bit ahead on you, you could use that to maybe slow them down in standard. That's fine, but in expanded, you have a ton of cards that can pop themselves, let your opponent take prizes, and it would be pretty easy to do that within your first couple turns, even your first. In some cases, to like force your opponent down to one prize, put them on the edge basically of winning the game, and then you play like Reset Stamp to handlock them, right? Like because of that, the more ignored expanded format, it has to have that more robust ban list. Otherwise, you would have these like nightmare like turn one kill scenarios, which I also understand that like that's one thing that Yu-Gi-Oh keeps an eye out for as well. Like
Very much
OTKs are a
so.
little easier to do now because of like how crazy fast the game is, and that's basically what you're pushing for in most cases. But there's stuff like the magical scientists like FTK from back in the day, like those kinds of things as well. I think at least both games try to keep an eye out for. But still, I'm very jealous of what you guys have because even just to keep the format fresh, it would be nice to be able to like take out a couple of problem decks and just force people to play something else, as much as that is also a marketing ploy.
Yeah, it's very much a marketing ploy. A lot of times you can tell a card's not going to get banned if Konami is not done selling it. So, like for instance, Dragoon or DP, we know those aren't going to get banned anytime soon because we know Konami wants to, make some more money off of them. A couple more reprints, get out those ultis, get out those Starlights.
I know it makes me super salty. I mean, it's like I get it. I get it too, and especially for the Pokemon TCG, where I mean, I might get into a little bit of trouble here, but it's not to say it's not as competitive as Yu-Gi-Oh is not the right word. It's maybe not as high of a skill ceiling as it is there. So I also think, like, because of who the game is marketed to, which does tend to be like kids these days, very young kids, as opposed to Yu-Gi-Oh, which I mean, admittedly, it is kind of marketed to an older crowd now. Having to like deal with a pretty frequently updated ban list, like having to explain constantly, oh no, you can only have like 2 or 3 of this card unless it's specifically printed on the thing. It's just not something they're interested in doing at all.
Yeah, that makes sense. Speaking of like the community at large, I kind of want to get into that too, because one thing I've noticed for our card game specifically is that Yu-Gi-Oh has a much higher competitive scene versus collector scene, whereas Pokemon scene is like much more collector focused than competitive focused. Like when I think about Pokemon, I think, oh, the $100,000 Charizards. I think like people like Logan Paul and Leonhardt are opening all these like old packs, trying to like plus off them, add their collections. I think of like people like Rhyme Style going in and getting these huge hauls of like graded cards. Whereas when you go to Yu-Gi-Oh, you're like, oh, there's all of like Farfa and MBT going off to all these tournaments. You know, you got like YCSs, and just those are the faces of Yu-Gi-Oh playing competitive. Where I feel like the faces of Pokemon are more of like collecting and investing and just like showing off like all these like cool cards. Is that about right to say?
Yeah, that's totally fair. I think anybody doing like gameplay stuff on the Pokemon TCG side would readily admit that the collector's sphere is way bigger than us. Even our largest content creators, I think, just push to use YouTube as a metric, like 80, 90,000 subscribers, whereas you have a lot of guys like Real Breaking Nate, Leon Hart. These guys are up in like the 6 digits of subscriber counts. Yeah, the collector side is a lot bigger, especially since the Logan Paul Charizard epoch began, where people are just collecting like crazy. It's kind of it's seen as an investment now, right? So a lot of people who really don't give a damn about the game at all and are just looking to turn a profit, they're getting into it and they're consuming a lot of that content because they do need to understand, like, from a collector's point of view, like why a Charizard card is more valuable because, like, hey, it's a more popular character, things like that. It's a little depressing for us who play who actually like play the game, because it means that we sort of have to worry about the bulk of our sets also being geared towards the collecting side. A perfect example actually is the Fusion Strike set, which just came out a little while ago. It was filled with a lot of bulk, a lot of filler. Like, even more and more in our sets, we get a lot of secret rares, like the gold. I can't remember if they're called hyper rares, but you get a lot more slots going towards cards that are going to look good sitting in someone's binder, but they're not, they're not competitive at all, right? Which kind of tells you that things are trending maybe a little bit more in the collector's direction. And we have a lot more like special sets. Like, you guys get things like maximum rare, maximum gold, I think, or ghosts from the past. Things like that, where you do get reprints, like maybe a new rarity is added. But generally speaking, they still tend to be like reprints that are good on the competitive side. Like, would that be fair to say?
Yeah, for the most part, our product is geared towards competitive. Like, we have a few things where they've been trying to get into the collector's market. So we recently added Starlight Rares, which are like the 1 per case rarity. We also have Collector's Rare, which will only show up in certain sets. But for the most part, our expensive cards are the ones that are like good in the game.
Yeah.
Sets are used to either push certain archetypes to the competitive limit or give legacy support to older archetypes, or sometimes they're just there to be fun. I'm looking at you, Ancient Guardians. Nothing competitive out of there, but the archetypes are cool.
Yeah, like that. I guess that's a big difference for us, because a lot of these special sets, I mean, to begin with, outside of staples like Switch, Pokeball, like the most basic cards, we don't do reprints a lot either. You just don't see stuff repeated anyway, so there's less incentive to do that. But then, they also just make a lot more collector sets now, like Champion's Path, for example, which was mostly reprints with a few new, like not too competitive cards put out. They added the like Black Hollow Charizard that I think I mentioned a little earlier on. We had Shining Fates recently as well, which again, it was it was more of a collector's thing. It's just, hey, here's a new, I shouldn't say new, but like here's a like an alternate rarity for a lot of the staple cards in this block right now. Like a few interesting like reprints like from the more recent sets anyways, like stuff you don't need, but again, it's just going to look good in your binder. And we're kind of seeing it, like, again, I think Japan just had a VMAX Climax set come out where there's going to be like a lot of alternate arts. Like you're seeing a lot of this stuff, and in some cases some of these cards are just from like 2-3 sets back, not even. So like things are definitely a little more geared towards the collectors side, for sure. Less so than in Yu-Gi-Oh, definitely.
This is very interesting. Very interesting. Well, switching focus from the collector's aspect of Pokemon, I want to know a little bit more of your like competitive side. So, from what I understand, every new generation you get like a new mechanic, kind of like how we do, but also very different. So, like you've been through like what level X's, EXs, capital EXs, Mega Evolution, Break, Prism Star, uh, V's, VMAXs, GXs, Tag Team GXs. I feel like I'm missing a couple, but like you have a lot of different like main deck mechanics that I feel like are very similar, but also very different in their own way, and also kind of like shake up the meta a little bit. Correct?
Yeah. So generally speaking, like in most main sets, you usually have one, maybe two new, and I guess main deck would be the best way to put it. So in the last block, it was GXs, and kind of the later variation on that was tag teams, which is like basically, let's say for lack of a better word, like two GXs put together into a much more valuable body. And alongside that, you had Prism Stars, which ran throughout the middle of the block all the way to the end. And generally speaking, it does tend to like stick that way. Obviously, again, like expanded being the exception where all of those kind of come into one space. But yeah, generally speaking, it is just the two main deck mechanics for the set. And depending on like when sets come out, like near the beginning of a block, for example, because the rotation doesn't like cut off at the end of one block, you have to factor that like, okay, we're in the V era now, but GXs are still going to be standard legal for a little bit. You'll see a lot of cards that will mention like both GXs and Vs, for example. But now that we've had the recent rotation where it's pretty much the V era onward, that stopped being the case, right? Outside of stuff that was technically would have been in release, or I should say in circulation, when Japan's format still had GXs, because theirs is a little different than ours. I guess in the same way that you guys have like the OCG, which is a little different than like the TCG and what's legal at that time. So the big thing, you mentioned that there's so many different mechanics that we've been through in the Pokemon TCG. Like we've done EXs like a couple times, GXs, Vs, whatever the case is. Like it's really interesting in that while the labeling kind of changes, the mechanics don't really differ in the way that summoning mechanics do in Yu-Gi-Oh, right? Like synchros, like the way you have to set them up, get them out, and generally speaking, like what they do on the field, it differs a little bit versus like an Xyz summon, for example, right, which has like very limited resources it's got access to. Like once you've used up all its materials, that's it. Like fusions too, the way all these different cards interact, it's really different. Whereas Pokemon, for the most part, you're basically just changing the letter on whatever like your special Pokemon mechanic is. So like EXs, GXs, now Vs, and by extension VMAXs, like basically they're all the same thing. They're big multi-prize Pokemon. So instead of taking the one prize card, you take like two or even three. Now when they get knocked out, like there's minor differences. Like the old like lowercase EXs, those actually would evolve up from like the regular Pokemon, whereas the more modern, I guess, EXs, they were just big basics that you could play down right away. Similar thing with GXs, like they started out, you would evolve up from regular cards, and then you get a slightly beefier, a slightly riskier card to use. V maxes and Vs is the same kind of thing. Like you have a big basic that now evolves into an even bigger thing, where if it gets KO'd, you like lose half the game right off the bat. like in that sense it's not super creative, and it kind of leads to the same kind of dynamic, over the generations, where you have your big multi-prize Pokemon kind of swinging it out at each other, and then if you're in a good format, they balance the little one prize guys so that they can kind of keep up and trade well. And that always keeps things interesting, right? It allows more room for like rogue decks to come out. People can tech a little bit more, try like interesting strategies, like actually use a lot of different Pokemon. Whereas like now we're kind of in a terrible format because it's just pick your big multi-prizer, swing at each other, and usually whoever got to evolve up first wins because you get the first, big attack on their three prizer, maybe you two shot them, whatever the case is. Like, it's basically just trading two big knockouts and then the game is over, right? Like it gets a little bit more interesting when you have some of these special mechanics like Prism Stars, for example, or Pokemon Break, where you're able to mix things up a little bit, and they're particularly good when they are like in a one-off kind of situation. Like the thing that made Prism Stars what so cool was that you could only have the one. The effects were pretty gnarly, but then once you used them up, like that was it. They were gone from the game, right? So you couldn't even necessarily abuse them. It was the same kind of thing with like the GX attack. It was really, really cool to have this one-time kind of game-breaking attack available to you. Like the format, it tends to be really interesting, and it gives you some variety to just trading knockouts over and over again, which is like the core of the game. Like yeah, like that's basically what the competitive scene and the overall game flow is nowadays. I don't know how much that differs from Yu-Gi-Oh. Like the Yu-Gi-Oh I remember, for example, obviously you're still trying to drop somebody's life points to zero, but it's less actually about like conserving your life points and like trading back and forth than it is just putting up big boards and either, one punching your opponent or, basically saying, hey, you can't play the game anymore because I have X number of negates set up. Like how I'm really interested to know how that's kind of how like the main gameplay loop has kind of changed over the years.
So yeah, you're kind of right on that. Where like Yu-Gi-Oh is weird in that, unlike in other games where their combo decks exist to perform their combo and kill you and win, our combo decks for the most part exist to create a control board where you bring out a board that slows down your opponent and controls them down, usually through the use of like negates, popping with DPE, or things along those lines. Because if we had like a combo deck that was like it's one combo because it'd kill you, that would just become an FTK due to how Yu-Gi-Oh works, because there's no resource system, and that'd just be unfair, unbalanced, and everyone would hate that. But the thing with Yu-Gi-Oh's extra deck is that's weird compared to like all these other concepts like the Pokemon EXs, GXs, and all that, Magic Gatherings, Planeswalkers, is that you always have access to your extra deck. Your extra deck is just there, ready for you to use at a moment's notice, and that really changes how the gameplay goes. Because back in the day, you had to like draw into your Monarchs, you had to draw into Dad, you had to like find these cards. Whereas now it's like, oh, there's a problematic spell card. Let me just put these two level 4s on top of each other. Here's Tornado Dragon, which is a very simplified version of how things are in the TCG. But one thing that's been really interesting as of late is that we've had a burgeoning of more mid-range decks showing up. Not quite the set 5-pass control decks of like Eldritch, and not quite the super hyper combo decks of like Adamantipator and of Dragon Link. We're seeing stuff like where they're doing more of their one-for-one removal, or they're just like setting up one guy and then they're like interacting with you. One thought that comes to mind is like the earlier versions of Tri Brigade, where you didn't really set up a board, but you had the ability to disrupt them on their turn through the use of cards like Revolt, where you could then summon a guy to like pop one of their cards, or you could attempt to lock them out of the game, but that was still easily dealable with because the thing they locked you out of the game with was a 1000 attack monster. So we're in this really interesting period where if things keep going the way they're going, we'll finally get a mid-range archetypes in Yu-Gi-Oh for the first time probably since like GOAT format. May not that far back, but for the first time in a long time, we're seeing a lot more diversity than just combo or monkey flip.
I mean, I do find that interesting actually, because the Pokemon TCG, it's kind of, in a way, it's becoming like Yu-Gi-Oh now, or at least the meme that everyone conceives of Yu-Gi-Oh as. In that you do see a lot more really combo heavy decks. Our current tier 0 deck, Mew VMAX, for example, it's got the ability to see most of your deck just on the first turn, right? And by just continuously playing cards down, you can essentially extend your combo and put yourself in basically like an unbeatable position, as long as you didn't low roll or like prize your essential combo pieces. And it's actually becoming more the case in the expanded format as well. Specifically because, like I've mentioned a couple times, you don't get the impression that they're balancing stuff for expanded. You have a lot of cases where a card is printed, for the standard format, let's say to help the little guys out. It says, I can't be used with a Pokemon GX. Well, that's fine, but now we're in the V era. V era cards are legal and expanded as well. So all of a sudden, this card that was very deliberately meant to be kept away from, your big GX guys can be used with Vs without too much of an issue. And you add that to the fact that unlike Yu-Gi-Oh, where you guys really tend to restrict your search, like those tend to be your limited cards, like Rhoda, for example, from way back in the day. Like, you guys you do not want to be able to draw, first of all, a ton of cards in a turn, but also search for them generically. Whereas, I mean, geez, like generic search is the bread and butter of most Pokemon decks, as is hard card draw, right? So by having a lot of these different cards be available to you, you are able to kind of just turbo through your deck, and kind of in a way, and again, this is mostly to the expanded format, you can basically set up like nigh unbreakable boards, or at least boards that ensure that the game is only going to last 2 or 3 turns as is, right? That's kind of the funny thing to me. It's also why I think a lot of people avoid the expanded format, because it is so fast, right? Standard is fast enough anyways that a lot of people are getting frustrated with it. But in expanded, yeah, it is possible to have a game be won or lost in the first turn or two, because the combo potential is actually bonkers right now. It's way different just to the standard format of the last block, where things were more methodical and mid-range. You weren't necessarily taking a knockout every turn, right? You actually had to plan ahead and play more of a resource war. So it is kind of interesting to me to see that Yu-Gi-Oh and Pokemon are kind of headed in the opposite directions, it seems.
Yeah, OCG. Yeah, we have the same thing where like our OCG, they have their own ban list. They're, I think, 2 or 3 sets ahead of us at all times, and their format's just like incredibly different too, because they don't have like the huge events that we do. A lot of their competitive stuff that we learn about is actually just from like local. So a lot of times you'll be like, oh hey, this deck is going throughout Japan, but like all of the stops are from like 6-man locals.
Mm-hmm.
This is kind of funny to me, because you would think the Japanese card game would be like super competitive over in its homeland, but it feels like sometimes a lot more of the major events are like over in the TCG.
Yeah, I think it's fair. It's fair to say that about Pokemon as well. I know whenever like a new set is coming up over here, people are, funny enough, also looking at these very small like 6 to like 12-man events over in Japan, and like trying to get a read on what's going to be good over here. With the proviso that they're going to have like a slightly different standard format than us at pretty much all times. So, you have to remember like, oh yeah, like X card is still legal over there, so this might not translate that well over here. But generally speaking, I get the impression that it's mostly the same.
Okay. Oh, one thing I'm curious about is, what is your prizing structure looking like? So in Yugioh, because of the wishes of Kazuki Takahashi, creator of the manga and everything, we are not allowed to do cash prizes for the major tournaments. It has to be all physical. So you'll get like a prize card, a special mat. I think they give away like consoles. So I think right now, if you win a YCS, you get a Switch and maybe a trophy, but you're not allowed to get like money from it, which makes the competitive scene of Yu-Gi-Oh, even though it's like the biggest part of Yu-Gi-Oh, also kind of weird to get into, because you won't be able to sustain yourself by being a competitive player because you can't get money from it.
Mm-hmm.
Do you guys have something similar where you can't give away money, or to like your tournaments give away like decent prizing?
I'll have to be careful here because I'm still pretty new to the game, and because of the COVID situation, I actually haven't been able to get too much into the competitive circuit there. I know at least on the local level, and I believe in the team challenges as well, most of the prizing tends to be merchandise, and I see that at a lot of the regionals. I believe you can earn travel credits towards like, the big national events, and I believe worlds as well. I think there are cash prizes, but I don't get the impression that they're terribly big. Certainly no one that I know of is making a living like off of doing the Pokemon competitive circuit, right? Most people are making way more money like producing content.
Yeah, I think that's about the same here. I was just wondering because I know that the game Flesh and Blood, they are doing $1 million prize pool for their tournaments once those like go live, which I thought was really interesting compared to how Yu-Gi-Oh is and how Pokemon is, where like, hey, maybe if you're good enough at Flesh and Blood, you can like make a living off of it. Whereas like this, it's like, well, you gotta invest all that time, but you have minimal rewards for it.
Yeah, it's not really, at least speaking to Pokemon specifically, it's not a game I think you can really make a career out of. Like if anything, you see more so that the largest creators in our scene right now, they're people who tend to do well, who did well at the in-person tournaments and who are doing really well online now. But again, they're seeing a lot more success just doing a deck profile video here and there, or like playing with each other, and then getting like side gigs, like doing commentary, for example. Anytime now there's like an online regional or nationals equivalent, right? It's very weird that way. I feel like aside from Flesh and Blood, which is crazy with that prizing there, and aside from maybe more recent MTG, you don't see a lot of games that are like really committed to having like a pro circuit, and allowing people theoretically to make a living off of that. Although I believe a lot of MTG players would tell me like, no, what are you talking about? Like the pro circuit is dead. They literally killed it. No one's no one's making a living doing this anymore either.
I mean, they did kill it, but that is a tangent for another time because I think it's about time we should start wrapping this up.
Mhm.
So before we end, I'd just like to ask you one last question. Do you think you want to get back into Yu-Gi-Oh, start like playing in like locals levels, or you're like, I'll just stay as like a casual observer, watch my favorite creator, Demir Tundra, do his stuff, and just live vicariously through him.
I mean, generally speaking, I've been trying to live vicariously through my favorite Yugi tubers there. It's a lot cheaper that way.
Yep.
Affordable as Pokemon is, I certainly think like jumping full on into Yu-Gi-Oh would probably be a bad idea right now. That said,
Maybe a little.
I believe you guys are getting like your proper online client, like I shouldn't say equivalent to our PTCGO because PTCGO is a relic of another era, but you guys are getting an online client, right?
Yeah, it's supposed to come out early this year, allegedly.
Mm.
It's gonna be like our equivalent to Arena, or whatever the new Pokemon client that they're cooking up is.
Yeah, so I mean, if that's the case, I could totally see myself getting back into Yu-Gi-Oh! Digitally only, as long as the free-to-play options are reasonable, and they're not killing you with microtransactions for like opening packs, or like charging you to trade with other people. Like if that's the case, I would be really keen to jump back in. Obviously there would be a steep learning curve, because the game is way different from when I left it behind. But yeah, I think like with anything, a good, relatively free to play online tool would definitely get me and a ton of other people back in. You know?
Yes, for sure. That's a sentiment I'm hearing a lot throughout like Twitter and like Reddit is like, oh, once this comes out, I'm gonna get back into Yu-Gi-Oh! I'm gonna start grinding that ladder. And I think that's really awesome that like it'll give people a way to play the game who are like, well, maybe I can't really afford real cards because I don't want to spend $1,000. But yeah, I hope that when Master Duel comes out, you're able to like give it a shot, see how you like the modern game. Maybe we can talk again later, see how your opinions have changed or stayed the same about Yu-Gi-Oh.
Yeah, hey, absolutely. And maybe you and I can, maybe we can get a game in, or maybe I'll start my own online sealed only series. I don't, I don't know. We'll see what the future holds.
Awesome, awesome. Well, it's been a pleasure having you. Hope we can talk again soon. And yeah, just thank you again for coming on.
Hey, anytime, man. It was a pleasure.
All right, and that'll be wrapping things up. See you all whenever I post another video. And be sure to go check out Let's Play Pokemon down below. He does really awesome like deck profiles and gameplay for Pokemon, usually on PTCGO. He plays around with like a lot of like rogue decks, which I find really interesting.